For the final round, well not for round 6, but the last round of this day, which we're all thankful, gives me great pleasure on this debate to invite the Prime Minister from THBT to open the debate. Is that?
Do we wait for the other training?
No.
Okay.
The debate must go on.
Let's go. Yeah.
Yeah.
Mr. Chair, China has always presented itself as a nationalistic body. Massive amounts of investments are funneled into policies and projects which nurture this social value, which allows individuals to cultivate on the ground this feeling of nationalism that unifies their nation. And we think we have to look at the best interest of China in today's debate. It's all about what will help them the most, what will help them maximize their investments in this goal, and to help them be able to forward this value. And this is an extension of what the movement which they have already taken into launching to begin with. And we have to show you in the end how this is an effective mechanism, and if anything, it's just strategic for them to do so. And the policy of affirmative will be quite simple. 4 prongs, Mr. Chair. First, we want to incentivize these individuals by making the process of naturalization easier. Beyond that, we will have calibrated financial incentives which will come in form of tax cuts, better healthcare benefits, and a lump sum money in the end. Obviously, this will all be calibrated depending on how effective and how important these individuals are, these celebrities are, in terms of getting more attention and getting them to nationalize and to have and to give a focal point for this goal. But more than that, if assuming they decide, well, I want to become another national of another country, we won't stop them. We're not that cruel. But we also recognize they also have to return the lump sum amount, but will allow them to continue to change their nationality again. The reason why this policy is quite effective is quite simple. Citizenship itself can help these individuals also promote themselves. China, Mr. Chair, is one good focal point in presenting yourself to the world to gain popularity. But beyond that, we think the financial incentives in itself will sweeten the pot in making sure that there's enough incentive and push and the drive towards allowing them to be able to be a part of this nation. And I'll present to you 2 argumentation under this. First is the idea on how it's in line with state goals of forwarding nationalism, and if anything, it's the most effective system. And second, it's in line with the concepts of citizenship anyway, which is why it's also legitimate for them to take such a tool. First idea, how it's in line with forwarding nationalism. Citizenship, Mr. Chair, needs to be understood in this manner. It's a recognition that your identity and what you represent is inherently linked to a certain group of individuals, to a certain nationality, to a certain culture, to a certain value. And that's always been the epitome of what nationalism has always been about. It's about representing your nation, about being an ambassador of a certain group of people. And China has always recognized this. They've always wanted to forward locally and to cultivate a culture where individuals will want to go back to their roots, to always recognize themselves as Chinese, as part of the nation. You want a rallying point, Mr. Chair. You give a face to your movement as well. You give them an ability to point out to an individual and to link yourself to them based on the values they represent. When we're talking about, for example, Olympic athletes in the Beijing Olympics, they represent excellence when they won. Things like this, Mr. Chair. And you want individuals to look at that and to feel pride when they're thinking that they came from the same to the same nation. In the end, you want to make sure that they're able to cultivate this. But on the second level, on the international level, how they want to present themselves to the world. China's always given a premium on how it presents itself to the international community. It wants to compete in the global market, and to be able to enter that global market, a huge chunk of their goal is to be a part of the mainstream. Mr. Chair, they want to be a part of the consciousness of the globe, which is why in the 2000 Beijing Olympics, a huge part of it was being a part of the mainstream consciousness of the world and using different faces that will allow individuals to be a part of that movement. They want to create massive long-term revenues as a whole. And we think this is best able or best given they are best capacitated to do this when you have individuals to be able to point out and to root back to China. But before I go on, go.
From what countries are you going to get this ethnic Chinese who are non-citizens from generally?
Anywhere from the world? I mean, we're talking about like the actress, the actress in her, and other actresses and other point of views and other popular individuals. We really don't mind where they came from, as long as, Mr. Chair, they are still ethnically Chinese and people still link themselves and still feel that kind of empathy that they are Chinese and they are a part of that nation, simply disadvantaged by geographical things. So why is this the best way? In the end, Mr. Chair, you have to recognize that when you have popular individuals within your nation who are part of your populace, what happens? You have these individuals inherently linked to you. These values that they represent, etc., will be a part of your nation. Individuals want to be a part of that. Locally, internationally, they look into it and they want to be a part of it. They buy into it. That's why a lot of these individuals bring in a lot of tourism. Leading, Mr. Chair, if you look at Jackie Chan, for example, the kind of tourism it brings in Hong Kong, etc., people, popular individuals within their nations bring in a lot of money. I assure you, we get a lot of big bucks from Macau and all these individuals. So in the end, you want China to be able to maximize this. These people can still get that kind of feeling from the world because they want to forward the idea that ethnically that is a part of your citizenship and the concept of citizenship, which enters the second idea, how it's in line with the concept of citizenship. Because really what is important with this is you have to understand that the social contract is still in place. Because really citizenship is about the services that you can provide into the country, the returns that you can give to the country. And when you give a lot of return, Mr. Chair, that is when the state rewards you as well. For example, they value individuals who get married. They give you tax cuts. They allow, when you have charity, they give them tax cuts as well. Essentially, the state recognizes that there are certain individuals that you are willing to reward. But even more special, these popular individuals, these celebrities, will be bringing in so much more to your nation. One, it will unify the idea or the ideals that you want to present. Two, they bring in a lot of big bucks because of popularity and the kind of tourism that they afford you. And we think that they deserve more, and they should be able, and the state should be able to incentivize them to become a part of their nation and to be a part of their capacity building to be able to forward this goal. So in the end, there are no harms. Individuals on the ground won't, the Chinese government itself will be able to calibrate who to choose and who to pick out anyway. There is no harm to China. If anything, it will only benefit them financially in terms of the values that they want to present as that of a unified nation, as that of a nationalistic nation, as that of being Chinese ethnically. Thank you.
Right, we thank the speaker for her speech and invite the first speaker for position and leader for
The clash of opposition is simple. We believe it's not in China's interest. It will harm China in terms of its own citizens and in terms of its own image. Secondly, there's no urgency or necessity for this kind of policy to happen anyway. And thirdly, this is principally wrong for China to do. Let's go on immediately with the rebuttals to the previous speaker. Because her main argument is that this kind of policy will help the nationalist policy that China wants to create in terms of creating and reinforcing a cultural narrative of what it means to be a Chinese. We think this is very problematic, and my POI was very critical because she said that we will get anyone who is ethnically Chinese anywhere in the world. Why is that so? Because in her speech, she never characterized who these foreigners were and what's the link on how they will be able to forward the Chinese narrative that China wants to forward as a one China policy. We'll tell you what they are or who they are in terms of what these artists or foreigners are. We think before you become a popular artist in China, you have to be, if you're a foreigner, you have to be a popular artist in your own nation first. And then you have to be popular in your region. Which means that to some extent, these foreigners who are ethnically Chinese but are popular artists or celebrities are to some extent already imbibed or acculturated to a certain culture in the country where they belong. What does this mean? This means that in terms of forwarding the cultural narrative of what it means to be Chinese, these foreigners who are ethnically Chinese do not necessarily fit it. Yes, they might look Chinese, but they don't act Chinese, and they don't really forward cultural Chinese values. For example, we think this is a wrong example for her to use Jackie Chan. Because one, Jackie Chan grew up in China. That's why he imbibed Chinese values, and that's why Chinese people like him. But secondly, he's already a Hong Kong citizen. And if you're a Hong Kong citizen right now, you're probably a Chinese citizen as well. But secondly, Zhang Ziyi is a problematic example for their side. Because she is popular regionally and globally, but she's not that liked by Chinese people as well. We don't think Zhang Ziyi helps in the forwarding of the cultural narrative of Chinese values. Why? She's so liberal. Chinese old elder people and even the younger people cannot relate to her. They know she's a big artist in Hollywood and where else, but they don't really feel affinity towards her even if she looks Chinese. Because she doesn't necessarily share the same values. She left her parents at an early age, and in China, it's very important to take care of your elderly. Those are the kinds of Chinese values that these kinds of foreigners won't necessarily be able to help in forwarding the narrative. So we think her whole argumentation was very much destructive because the link was missing. Later, no thank you. But secondly, we think she assumes that they will be seen as nationalistic just because they change their citizenship or they are not naturalized. We think the people will look to the motivations of these celebrities, of these foreigners who are ethnically Chinese, who naturalize as being Chinese. We think that the people in China will look to them as not as the face of a nationalistic movement. They will see these people as an opportunistic people because there are a lot of incentives they are offering. So, most likely, for reasonable people, they will think that these kinds of foreigners are using this policy not to forward the Chinese cultural narrative, but for self-benefit or self-gain. And I'll talk to you more later on why homegrown artists and homegrown taxpayers will not necessarily favor these immigrants or naturalized citizens. Yes.
Don't be nitpicky. The Chinese government is quite smart. They'll get to pick and choose who they want to nationalize depending on the kind of value they want to forward. So if they don't want liberal ideas or they don't want liberal people, then don't get the actors.
But most likely then, China will never get anyone at all because a lot of countries in the world where you have ethnically Chinese popular people come from liberal countries like South Korea, where you have that kind of machinery to promote the popularity of artists, or for example, in the Philippines. So we think they will not get anyone at all. And most likely, they will get popular people. Even you argue that they will want this popularity to forward. So, which really will they go for? Popularity or conformity to Chinese values? We don't think you will get foreigners who really imbibe that Chinese cultural narrative at all. Let's go to the principled objection why we don't want this policy. Because we don't think it's in the interest of China, because it violates the right of existing Chinese citizens to be prioritized. Why do you have to prioritize your own citizens? Because they stayed there. They were the ones who stuck with you. They were the ones who contributed back to your society. Therefore, the government logically should prioritize you on other people. No, sit down. Let's look at the comparison because she's asking it in an interjection. Let's look at artists. We think local artists in China have a very hard time in making it big in China already. Because it's a huge country, you need to cater to millions of people to be able to enter the mainstream. Or if you want a niche market, you have to be able to appease the critical elite in Beijing. There's a lack of media giants to be able to promote you effectively nationally and regionally, unlike in South Korea or in other countries where you have the Hallyu wave or you have this kinds of entry of popular artists from Hollywood. What's the point of this kind of premise? We think these kinds of foreigners will just get in and now be prioritized because of all of these huge investments, which will now not go to this local artist in terms of promoting the local Chinese guitar or people who can sing Chinese songs natively because of the empire in the past or other Chinese culture. We think they can't say China is very rich. They can just subsidize everybody. China also has scarce resources, even if it's now the growing economy in the world. But secondly, we think the incentive has to be very, very, very enticing for these people to naturalize or for these people to go to China in the first place. Sit down. And she agrees because she says they will give them tax cuts, subsidies, things that a lot of people don't have in China and things that a lot of artists don't have as well as a support from the government. So we think principally it's unfair to these artists who are homegrown and should be prioritized in terms of forwarding the nationalist Chinese cultural narrative that they want to forward. But secondly, in terms of nation builders, most likely these foreign artists are sons and daughters of migrant Chinese. We think it's unfair to taxpayers who will shoulder the burden of these incentives to pay for this kind of policy when their parents and them stayed in China to be able to help China grow. These people who are sons of foreigners and who grew popular in South Korea or Malaysia were left the country and didn't help the country forward in the first place. So we think a lot of elder people don't want to support such kind of policy anyway because they will be the ones to bear this kind of thing. But secondly, in terms of urgency of promoting nationalism, this policy doesn't need to be done anymore because China already has that kind of promotion in terms of propaganda, advertisements, in terms of advertisements in CNN and other things to be able to promote the Chinese cultural narrative. But secondly, we don't think it's important for these foreigners to be granted citizenship so that you can forward the Chinese cultural narrative. We think in our side, you promote it better because these foreigners are citizens in other countries. If they're citizens in other countries, they can promote that they are ethnically Chinese. I came from China. My parents were Chinese. They'll talk about their cultural roots and be able to spread the nationalism there to their fellow Chinese migrants there and to other people in other countries. We think for all those reasons, because there's no urgency, China doesn't have to do this.
Right, thanks speaker for his speech. Invite second speaker from the photo team.
At the very core, Mr. Chair, these celebrities and public figures that we're talking about are already part of pop culture. And in fact, they are part of a global collective consciousness that exists in much of the world. And we think it is in China's best interest, and in fact, even in these artists' best interest, to actually accept the citizenship, because we think that pop culture is one of the most important tools to deconstruct specific stereotypes and deconstruct a lot of things, a lot of mixed conceptions. And we think that at the end of the day, pop culture is very important in allowing a deeper understanding, a more meaningful discourse towards all of these cultural stereotypes and all of these things. So I'm going to give you two arguments. Firstly, I'm going to tell you how we deconstruct and give face to the different identities and facades of being Chinese, which is in fact a direct response to Jesus' argument on how these foreigners are not Chinese at all. But second, I'm going to show you how eventually we are able to show unity, how China is able to show unity with the rest of the globe by actually being a part of the discourse on global popular culture, and how in fact we are able to, and how in fact when we contribute to all these kinds of things, we actually allow China to fight against all these unnecessary stereotypes that have necessarily come about in the course of their history. But first, what did Jesus say? Jesus said that foreigners are selfish, and the homegrown stars and people in China will be heavily burdened. Let the responses be this. The first response is simple. They do make contributions, Mr. Chair, and they actually have, in fact, two contributions. Firstly, they contribute to global culture, right? They actually allow people to understand what being Chinese is, and that they actually allow people to be proud of these Chinese stars. But secondly, right, once they're citizens, they're going to pay taxes. And we think that we need to talk about China, which is a government that gets more from its people rather than how it gives back to the people. And we don't think that, the taxes that they will pay is really something that we have to avoid. We think, in fact, that these taxes can actually help these people at the end of the day, given how these celebrities and public figures actually have income of millions, if not billions, of dollars. The second response is this. In fact, we think that these foreign stars that they're talking about actually help the homegrown stars and other Chinese people anyway. And it's not just about tourism that we're talking about, something that Seth already told you right from the get-go. When you look at Jackie Chan, for example, Jackie Chan was famous only in Hong Kong until Bruce Lee, who was from the United States, came along. We think then that these foreign stars that we're talking about are actually important in making sure that the homegrown stars actually get their name out there and even become popular, not only to the Chinese public but also to the global public by themselves. So really, we're not actually harming the industry; we're actually helping it. But actually, this is what we're going to say. It's not really a burden to the Chinese people, right? Because we've already established from the start that we're not actually going to take away money from the Chinese people and give them to these artists. What we're going to do is to actually cut their taxes. That's a very different system from stealing money from Chinese people. It's a system where, for example, your contribution, the amount of money you have to contribute is less, but it does not mean that the people around you would have to necessarily contribute more. The next point they had is simple. There is no urgency. In fact, we're going to say that there is an urgency. it's very important for China right now, especially since it's developing and becoming a global powerhouse, to show that it can assimilate with the global culture. It's very important for China to prove that it is not a hermit, that it is not oppressive. It is very important for China to actually prove that there are many facades of being Chinese and that culture is something that they look forward to as well. But even if urgency does not exist, it never hurts really to have a policy where you bring forward national pride, where you actually bring your name out in the limelight. But lastly, what was the thing they said? They told us that these foreigners are imbibed with other values, which will make them not truly Chinese. First thing is, if they do accept this citizenship, then they must feel a link to China, right? Which means that at their very core, there is still some sort of Chineseness into them. But second really is, so what? We think that there are different kinds of Chinese, that you can be Chinese even if you were born and raised in the West anyway. Moreover, Zhang Ziyi may not be popular, but we think that she speaks to some Chinese people out there, to some Chinese people who see themselves in her. And that's why it's very important for China, because it can also mean that China can reach out to its own youth and tell them that you don't have to be a specific stereotype, that we also recognize your contribution even if you're Chinese and liberal. But before I proceed to my argument, go.
To be able to prove that China can assimilate into a global culture, it has to show that it's not that conservative, it can adjust to liberal tendencies. So, how is that directly consistent with your Prime Minister in terms of forwarding a Chinese cultural narrative to its people?
Because Chinese cultural narrative is not just strictly conservative. Culture is dynamic and culture is multifaceted. And that is where my argument comes in. And what I'm going to talk about how we deconstruct these stereotypes. We think that these ethnic Chinese celebrities that we're talking about can present another side of being Chinese citizen. Because citizenship is not just about being there in China. It's also about, in fact, about giving back to the state. Something that they do by actually contributing to global culture, right? But we think that in the case of these public figures, because some of them are born and raised in the West, but they actually give back by being a point of Chinese pride. So therefore, we say that it is actually a way for China to convey that not all Chinese people will have to wear cheongsams, not all Chinese people will have to, have the strict Chinese traditional values that exist in global media. What we mean then is simple. When China gives these people citizenships, it actually brings these people into the spotlight, tells them that yes, they are Chinese and we are proud to have them. What they also say is that when some of these Chinese people are actually born and raised in the West, then China tells us that you can also have Chinese values, that they can have Western values, but still be Chinese at the end of the day. You show a plurality of identities out there by claiming celebrities as their own. And this is very argument, because this is very meta, and this is very important, because right now, China is earning flack for being a place that oppresses national identity, right? So what you do is you actually contribute to the global understanding, to the global discourse that, hey, this is not necessarily the case. We actually support all these kinds of Chinese culture. But secondly, this is an extension of the first idea, is that we actually contribute to global culture. Because what you do is not only do you give China publicity when news of being granted citizenship comes around, but you also show and contribute to the global pop culture. That China is actually aware of all these things, that China appreciates all of these things that is happening around the world. So in terms of their image, you show that China is not a hermit. That China is actually open to discourse, and China is open to a deeper exchange of cultural ideas and all other kinds of cultural principles. It shows you that China is open to all these other things as well, even if they are Western, whether they're conservative or liberal, and all of these things. At the end of the day, we think that pop culture is a tool for empowering China, for empowering homegrown artists, and for empowering the Chinese youth. And for all these reasons, Mr. Chair, we've never been prouder to propose.
Right, thank the Speaker for his speech and invites the second Speaker of Opposition, the Deputy of Opposition.
Ladies and gentlemen, growing up in a foreign country and understanding its kinds of customs, learning to thrive in the kinds of conditions that it allows you to give forms the kind of person that you are, and it forms the kinds of idea that you're going to propagate. We think ultimately the kinds of things that these foreigners are going to be repatriating to the state, to China, are not Chinese ideas. They're not Chinese values. We think ultimately what they're doing, in fact, is simply copying these foreign models and putting it into China and putting a Chinese label on it. We don't think it's about enriching the culture, ladies and gentlemen. We might even say it's replacing it. Because we think ultimately what government wants to do is put this idea that we always want to be able to conform, or we always want to be able to show that we can modernize. But we have to question, are these really things that are ultimately in the interest of Chinese individuals? Are these in fact things that are in line with their culture? And we think that it isn't. We think we have to look at how, in fact, these kinds of attentions are going to hurt the Chinese government, which is why, no thank you, in my argument I'm going to be tackling about how this policy hurts these icons and ultimately stains the image of China because of this. So before I go on to that, let me go on to 5 rebuttals. Let's first look at this idea of taxes, and we think this is something that's very petty, because we think every citizen in China pays taxes. And if you think about it, individuals who have lived in China have paid taxes to the Chinese government ever since they were born. So we question, why do you prioritize these foreigners? We think even then, the kinds of benefits that these artists in terms of taxes are going to give are not mutually exclusive. No, thank you. But more than that, they talk about the fact, well, we're not actually diverting the funds. We think they are, because one, they talked about paying them a lump sum. But more than that, tax cuts aren't simply the fact that, you know what, you're not getting money from you. But you're talking about cuts in potentialities. You're talking about the fact that this money could have gone into supporting other local economists, other local archaeologists. No, thank you. All of these individuals who could have worked for for all these things that China is investing in terms of projects. Secondly, let's look at this idea on how, well, now you can reach the younger audience. But we think, ladies and gentlemen, this is something that we don't necessarily see coming true. Because if you look at the fact on how you look at these foreign individuals, these are individuals who their entire lives, they were able to enjoy freedoms which Chinese youth will never be able to understand. You might encourage them to be liberal, you might encourage them to be more Western, but these are things that even in their own society, their parents or their society will tell them are not things which are good for you. These are things, no thank you, that in fact might even show or create a separation or a disunification in the kinds of relationships that the young generation has with the old generation. And we think that this is problematic if you're talking about, no thank you, having a united China. Because we think that the specific nuance with China and the reason why it's so strong is because it's been able to retain that kind of cultural influence. It's been able to retain a strong cultural image that isn't necessarily taunted or doesn't necessarily feel threatened or needs to, or it doesn't need to show that it has to accept Western standards in order to be something that is strong, in order to be something that they can be proud of, contrary to what government is arguing. No, thank you. We think next, let's go into this idea of now how at least these individuals, that they're not stealing the attentions from the public, these locals, but we think they are. Because if you talk about being able to launch, let's say, a new economist, if you're being able to talk about famous professors, in fact, usually you launch or you have a few. You don't, even if you have 30 brilliant ones, the state forwards a certain number. And we think it's because of the fact that these opportunities are limited. If you're talking about the kinds of subsidies, the kinds of attention or facilities or access that the state can give them. So we think we think that these are things that you're going to be giving to these individuals instead of your locals. And we think that this is something that is not fair. We think that ultimately these people are simply copycats and not necessarily are copycats, but don't necessarily represent China. I might look like I'm Chinese, but I'm not from the mainland. Yes?
So, ma'am, you have a problem with the younger Chinese thinking that it's okay to be liberal. So instead, you want them to have their own images of liberal Chinese to be people who've given up their citizenship. Don't you think that's even worse?
Madam, we think that if you look at it, there's always going to be a kind of image that China wants to present. That's the reason why if there are Chinese who have changed their nationality, They say that they have Chinese ethnicity, but they also recognize that they are individuals and citizens of other countries. So we think the kind of message that you're sending is not going to be inconsistent, and we think that these things are clear. Let me go into my argument and how it hurts these icons, because we think that these public figures have gained their base and they grew from their home country. And we think they're better off spreading or promoting Chinese values, or maybe what it means to have a Chinese ethnicity, if they don't naturalize. I'm going to prove to you two things. First, I'm going to prove how it limits their growth and the possible contributions they might have. But secondly, I'm going to show how it in fact how this highlights the censorship issues which will cause a popular backlash. Let's talk about two scenarios. First, we think it's possible that these artists, or maybe scientists, economists, will repatriate, will move to China because they're Chinese citizens. First, we face the problem of uprooting. Because by moving your base, if you're an academic, your academe is what forwards you. These are the people who enable you. These are the people, the kinds of connections who actually allow you to access, no thank you, these kinds of information. No thank you. For these professions, connections determine the level of funding, the attention that you get, the ability for you to be able to create kinds of researches or to create these kinds of effective results, which we think are going to be, which we think you're going to be forcing them to start from scratch. But secondly, even if they choose not to repatriate, let's say they stay in Malaysia but they are of Chinese citizenship. In particular countries first, you already simply give exclusive rights to people who are your citizens. Talk about, for example, land ownership. Talk about preferential treatment towards these individuals when it comes to accessing government facilities. We think you actually disable their access to these kinds of things, which will make them less able to forward these kinds of contributions. But secondly, we think their general contributions are going to be hurt, because by being a Chinese citizen, they are now liable and they are now under the China's censorship laws. Effectively, the kinds of reports they could write about, the kinds of songs they could sing about, the kinds of theses they could write about are essentially censored at the end of the day. What does this do, ladies and gentlemen? We think ultimately, first, it creates a backlash against China. Because how the world will see this, or how these native countries will see this, is that they are taking the brilliant minds and idols of these countries and they are silencing them. Whether or not this is true, even if these countries, China might not be forcing them to do this, these are still the way that people will see this. That the critical mass that once supported these people might even question whether or not what these people are forwarding are simply Chinese propaganda. And we think ultimately, if you're talking about using their reputation, these are things that they're going to lose if you use these kinds of incentive-based methods. So with that, we're proud to oppose. Thank you.